So as Bruce mentioned, there are cards on each table. If you can write your questions down on them, and when you have a question, just hold it up in the air and we'll go around and collect it. While we're waiting for some of those to come up here, the first question comes from me. It's my privilege. But building on what we've been talking about, you mentioned you have a bill where you would like to get $114 billion for new voting machines. The question is, there's been a lot of talk about the security of the current voting machines and whether they're at risk of being hacked. How serious of a risk is this currently?
Thanks for the question. $114.5 million of funding is what I'm being proposed. That's a joint endeavor between the state and the counties because elections are a joint endeavor between the states and the counties. And so when the state offers $114.5 million, that will not cover the entirety of the cost. Some of that will still be borne at the local level, but it's important to note that the large majority of it will be handled by the state funding if we can get that dollar amount approved. Hackability, hacking. Anybody that has a concern about the integrity of our elections process should go visit the County Board of Elections and do a tour there. You'll learn some things when you do. One of the things you'll learn is that the machines that cast ballots and the machines that tabulate ballots are never, ever connected to the internet. Let me repeat that. The machines that count ballots, where ballots are cast, the tabulation machines, never connected to the internet. The only thing external that they're connected to is the 110-volt socket in the wall, honestly. Now, what that means is on election night, when the results are tallied, there's an individual that writes those results down on a clipboard and walks across the room to a separate computer that's attached to the internet, and that's how those get reported. So, is there a possibility that someone could hack a voting machine? Absolutely. They would have to physically touch that machine in order to do that, and they would obviously be a felon when they did so. Now, we have to be constantly vigilant. As we said in the military, the good guys have to be right every single day, 24 hours a day. The bad guys only have to be right once. And so we have to be constantly vigilant about election security, and part of that is investing in that next generation of voting machines. Although it's mostly a question of efficiency at this point because the machines are becoming hard to maintain, parts are getting hard to find, and that kind of thing.
We have a number of questions about accessibility. First off, what will you do as Secretary of State to increase the opportunities for voter registration?
So right now, you can register to vote using the piece of paper, you can register to vote using the online system, and so there are good opportunities to register. The question is, what are we doing to make sure that people avail themselves of those opportunities? One of the things that actually just came to me, and I'm probably going to propose this as a piece of legislation, is a lot of us do we renew our license plates via mail or online now, and as we all know, the Motor Voter Act requires that voter registration forms be made available at the BMV location. Well, a lot of folks don't walk into those BMV locations anymore. A lot still do. And so maybe putting a link on that online site where people go to renew their plates is a good idea, so people know that they can register to vote at the same time as just a reminder, and takes them to the online site for doing it. Or the paper thing that comes in the mail saying it's time to renew your stickers on your license plate. Maybe put a thing there, hey, log on to the Ohio Secretary of State's website to register to vote. But some of it just relies on us. Believe it or not, I've got a 19-year-old and a 20-year-old little brother. And when both of them turned 18, I gave them voter registration forms in their birthday cards. How many of you are doing that for the young people in your life? You should be. You should be. I've been working with a group of pastors in the Cleveland area that came to me with an idea that they wanted to create Voter Registration Awareness Day. It gives them an opportunity to talk about it from the pulpit, kind of an excuse to mention to folks in the community that it's time, if you haven't registered, to register to vote. And so I introduced a bill to do that, to create Voter Registration Awareness Day. Again, there are great avenues and convenient avenues out there for people to register. The important thing is we need to push people in that direction now.
Related to that, there's been a lot of tussling over the amount of time of early voting in the state. if you're elected Secretary of State, would you look to extend the hours, maintain them, or continue to try to shrink them?
First of all, on the number of early voting days, Ohio is a leader in the nation, by far. We've got 28 days of early voting in the state. That makes us in the top 10 in the country. Certainly the most permissive number of early voting days in the entire Midwest. States like New York, for example, have 0 days of early voting. The only way you can vote is by voting on election day unless you have a doctor's excuse or what have you. And so first we need to celebrate what we have in Ohio and commit ourselves to keeping that. Nearly a full month of early voting is a good thing for Ohio. And as we know now, a lot of people cast their ballot, almost 40% I believe is the current number before election day. Now I like to wait till a little bit later in the month. I think that you want to hear the closing arguments before you make your decision. I think that some people have realized that lately as well. But early voting hours that are currently in place are the result of a settled lawsuit where the Secretary of State sat down with a few entities that had brought a lawsuit, and they've reached a settlement, particularly as it relates to those Sunday voting hours. I think that maintaining ample opportunities for people to take part of early voting is important. That's something that I will maintain as Secretary of State. But you have to be reasonable about it. You don't want to make the boards of elections run 24-hour early voting centers, for example, or that kind of thing. Remember, people can vote from the comfort of home by mail, which is always a convenient way to do it, and having reasonable weekend hours is the good step to make sure that people can avail themselves of that 7 days a week, particularly in the 2 weeks leading up to the election.
The next question from our audience: will you continue the current policy, if upheld by the Supreme Court, of pruning voter rolls by targeting people who haven't voted recently?
The Secretary of State, along with our county boards of elections, have a responsibility to maintain accurate voter rolls. That, by the way, is nothing new. That's always been a part of the office, and it goes back decades that the current process in place has been carried out by both Democratic and Republican Secretaries of State. By the way, Jennifer Brunner, Sherrod Brown, when they were Secretaries of State, carried out the process that's laid out in the Ohio Revised Code that essentially says that if you go 6 years without voting and don't respond to something that's mailed to your home, then you can be removed from the voter rolls, or that process can be undertaken to remove someone from the voter rolls. As you mentioned, this is pending right now in front of the United States Supreme Court. The process that Ohio carries out is identical or very similar to what's carried out in something like 12 other states. If there is a better way to do it, then I'm open to that. But I would say that the process that is in place now is a reasonable one, in that it allows us to maintain accurate voter rolls. If 6 years isn't long enough, then maybe the court can tell us what a period of time is. But when in our past we have had counties with more registered voters than there are actually people living in that county, it shows us that we've got a problem, and that has happened. We need to find ways to maintain those accurate voter rolls that don't inconvenience any citizens, and that's the challenge that we'll always have. It's a matter of accurate database management as much as anything, and honestly, maintaining those accurate voter rolls are the best thing that we can do to prevent voter fraud versus any of the other ideas that have been out there. And so maintaining those accurate rolls is an important priority. It's something that I would work with the voting rights advocates as well as our county boards of elections to make sure is done in a thoughtful and balanced way.
A question about the national elections. Are you still supporting President Trump's voter fraud commission, even though it went out of business due to lack of evidence?
I don't think that it's ever a bad thing to look at public policy solutions that could be out there. When the president announced the creation of this elections commission, the goal was for it to be a bipartisan commission, as has been the case in previous presidencies. After the 2012 election, President Obama created a panel as well that included the election lawyers from the Romney campaign and the election lawyers from the Obama campaign that made a lot of recommendations, including, for example, online voter registration and many others for improving our elections. when we can put thoughtful people together to look at solutions for how things can be made better, I don't think that that's ever a bad thing. Obviously, this panel did not function well and has since been disbanded as a result. If we can assemble thoughtful people to work on improving our elections, then that's something I would always be supportive of. It would obviously be up to policymakers, whether it's in the U.S. Congress or in the state legislature, to decide whether they would implement the findings of such a study, though.
We brought up the president, a question about his presence in Ohio. Would you welcome him to Ohio to campaign for you?
I don't think anybody would be well advised to turn down the president if the president was willing to come and campaign for them. I would welcome that. That doesn't mean, though, that I believe in everything our president says or does. If you ever find a candidate you believe in and agree with 100% of the time, you may be looking in the mirror, and even if that's the case, you'll find that any of us that have served for more than a few years in a legislative capacity will tell you that maybe your views have evolved or changed on things. So do I agree with this president 100% of the time? Absolutely not. Do I support him as our commander-in-chief and as our president? I do. Is his approach to things different from mine? You bet it is. I tend to take a little bit more of a civil Midwesterner kind of approach to things. I don't tend to interact with people the way that he does. But listen, we didn't elect him to be a choir boy, and he's certainly not. But he is a change agent, and so if he wanted to come to Ohio and campaign for me, I'd welcome that.
Changing gears here slightly, what's your position on state historic tax credits?
Big supporter of state historic tax credits. Did that question come from Dave Labor? I serve on the Ohio History Connection Board, formerly Ohio Historical Society, and I formerly served on the Summit County Historical Society Board. I had to unfortunately leave their board because they decided to seek state funding for something, and so it was a conflict of interest. I had to leave that board, but remain supportive of their mission. There's this delta that exists between what's economically viable and not as it relates to historic preservation. And this is one of those rare roles where I would advocate a public involvement in the free market that sort of fills that gap and bridges that gap between tearing down an old building and building something new or preserving what we have. I think that maintaining the character of our community by preserving historic buildings is vitally important.
If you're elected Secretary of State, what's the biggest problem that you hope to solve? Also, you're getting a shout out for thanks for celebrating women's suffrage.
The fact is you don't know, right? I mean, spending 8 years as the Chief Elections Officer and the Chief Business Filing Officer for the state of Ohio, you don't know what the future holds. What I can predict, and that's why we need a steady hand on the rudder. Quite candidly, you need somebody that's not an activist from either party. You want somebody who's able to call balls and strikes as your Secretary of State, because the integrity of our elections process is too important for someone to use it just sort of blindly for political gain from one party or the other. And so I think that working to make sure that people are confident in the outcome of our elections is important, and making sure that we protect the integrity of our elections, whether it be from foreign actors or others that want to try to undermine the credibility of our elections, is important. Preventing hacking is something that is a sort of an ongoing basis and an everyday priority. All of these are challenges that we face. With new opportunities also come new challenges, and the automation and technical advancements that we're making as a society certainly offer a mix of risks and rewards.
What's your position on right-to-work laws and prevailing wage laws?
I'm well known as a member of the sort of pro-labor Republican caucus. That's no secret. I do not believe that right-to-work is the right solution for Ohio. If others do believe that, then I think that the only route that they have to get something like that enacted would be to take it to the ballot. They've yet determined not to do that. And maybe they think that there's not the support out there for it. I don't believe that right to work is a good solution for Ohio. I'm a proud supporter of labor rights, including prevailing wage, and most recently we worked on project labor agreements as well. I think our role as public servants, though, is to maintain a balance. I think that, again, there have been overreaches by labor in history, and there have been overreaches by management in history. But certainly when it comes to the right of working people to be represented in their workplace and to be able to be part of a union, I firmly stand in support of them, and I'm 100% opposed to right to work.
This person wants to know what your proudest accomplishment is as a state senator, and also your most significant unresolved challenge from the legislature.
These introspective questions. All right, let me think here. I think I've got to say that both the state legislative redistricting reform, which we passed a few years ago, and the current redistricting reform, which is on the ballot in May, I think could have the longest lasting impacts. The Senate Joint Resolution 3, which I wrote and introduced a year ago, formed the basis of what became Issue 1. And so the bill that I wrote, or the resolution that I wrote, went on to become the constitutional language that all of you are going to see on the ballot in May. And so that's something I'm very proud of. Unresolved, I guess maybe again back to the civility issue. That's one of those that will never be finally solved, but it's something that we continue to work on. There's another issue that I've been working on for a while as a veteran, and for 4 years I was the only veteran in the state Senate. The rate of voter participation among active duty military personnel is remarkably low. And just simply numerically speaking, the number of people that are serving overseas in the military and voting is low. And there have been a lot of things put in place to help make it easier for overseas military personnel. That was one of the first bills I worked on, kind of got me involved in this whole elections stuff that led to me standing up here today asking to run for Secretary of State. But there's more that we can do. And so I'm working right now to try to put a few ideas together to inform people that are getting ready to deploy overseas what their rights are to cast a ballot, and to make sure that they avail themselves of that.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. One or two. Having several family members who have served in the military, including yourself, actually this is coming from the audience. What can we do to better support our veterans?
Support their spouses, girlfriends, boyfriends, and families. Those of us that serve are volunteers that are part of an all-volunteer military. They get to use the best equipment on earth and travel around the world with our best friends. I mean, I have a very positive view of the service. For me, it was the best time I've ever had in my life. For our family members back home, it's difficult. I'm thinking of Lauren, and I'm thinking of Kayla sitting up here, and maybe others that you know, when I was in Iraq, I could be sitting in the dining hall having a hot meal. I could be playing a video game or watching a football game with one of my teammates or working out in the gym. But in the minds of my mom and my wife and my friends back home, I was in a 24/7 firefight. Like, at least that was, they were constantly worried about me. And it's hard. I know that my wife and my mom both spent a lot of time on their knees praying for my safe return, and I credit them with me coming home. So the best thing you can do for our servicemen and women is to love and support and respect the family members that are back home.
Last question, this one's a hard one. How'd you meet Lauren?
You read this question. So I had just moved to Columbus to start school at Ohio State, and she had just finished college at Ohio University, and I'd like to say that we met at Sunday school. That's not the case. We met at a bar. It took me several hours to get up the courage to come over and talk to this woman who's still way out of my league. And she asked me two questions before she would give me the time of day. She asked me if I was a Browns fan, and she asked me if I was a Republican. So she was looking for somebody that matched her ideology, and she was looking for somebody who was loyal no matter what. So, thank you so much. Thank you.